Force Destiny by Eden Woods Parker on AO3. Chapter 1. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the First Order had been weakened with the recent command acquisition by Kylo Ren, resulting in the unlikely escape of the Resistance from what should have been a certain victory for the First Order in their mission to seize military control of the galaxy. Despite the victory, Leia Organa's resistance was in shambles. After suffering extensive losses at the Battle of Crait, the remaining members narrowly escaped with the aid of Rey's growing force powers. Fleeing through hyperspace aboard the Millennium Falcon, they were in search for a new base, safe from the reaches of the First Order. Following the loss of Jedi Master Luke Skywalker and Supreme Leader Snoke, the fate of the galaxy was left in the hands of two young Force users who shared a vital secret. Rey, the last hope for the Resistance, and Kylo Ren, the Dark Lord of the First Order, both sought to recover and rally their fracturing causes before they clashed in the final battle for the fate of the galaxy. Force Destiny, Chapter 2. I'll destroy her. Kylo Ren stormed down the dark corridor of the Finalizer, returning to his private chambers after their failure, his failure, to decimate the Resistance on Crait. 572 more steps until he reached the refuge of the small space in the galaxy that was truly his. He could finally be alone. Ironic that he held the entire galaxy in his grasp, yet a few walls and a bed were somehow the only part left that felt his own. That sentiment disgusted him, but it was a weakness he could train out of himself easily enough. As Supreme Leader, he had a choice of any quarters in the ship, of course. The General's quarters were more spacious and centralized in location. He could demand that Hux relinquish them to him, and he would feel no remorse in vacating the old ones. There were far more significant disputes, however, to engage in with his general. It had nothing to do with his sentiment, it was practical. His quarters suited him fine and provided him an advantage. Hidden away, they added an extra obstacle to Hux's constant tabs on him. 402 more steps, closer to his place to shut out the galaxy and farther from his failures on Crait. At first he had been consumed with short-sighted, foolish despair when she had shut him out. Then his father's dice had disappeared, reminding him that he was alone again. No, not again. He had always been alone. It should have been painful, but all he felt was relief. As the light inside him flickered out, he was hit with a liberating realization. The light he had felt inside himself had been hers, not his. When she shut out the bond, she had shut out the light. Kneeling in supplication and defeat, the base on Crait, and alone in the passenger compartment of his Upsilon-class command shuttle, he had accepted that she was gone. She didn't want him. And he didn't need her. He was better off without her. With the agony of her betrayal and finality of their broken bond, he found the comfort of darkness. The whispers of the darkness, words in his own voice that sounded decidedly too much like his fallen master, reminded him of his path. He had failed, but he hadn't strayed from his purpose. The fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders, as with every obstacle he had overcome, this loss had to befall him for his destiny to be realized. His destiny was within his grasp, but the war was far from over. Skywalker's stunt had made him appear weak. The Resistance would undoubtedly seek to rebuild quickly to best exploit his weaknesses, and the First Order was hesitant to accept him as their leader after his failure, but he would prove his worthiness to them all. Crait had only pushed him to become stronger, shaping him in his grandfather's image. He would destroy her. The Resistance had been in his grasp, but she had helped them all escape, in Han Solo's ship, no less. She had shut him out as if he had wronged her. as if betraying him and leaving him for dead after he spared her life wasn't enough. Snoke was wrong. Killing her wouldn't complete his path to the dark side. No, he should thank her. What she did for him was far greater. If Skywalker started him on this path that fateful night, then she finished it in the throne room. I offered her everything. Still, she betrayed me, just like Han Solo and Leia, Skywalker, Snoke. She was wrong. I am alone. No one can stand in my way. No one can take this away, this hatred. I will not stop until I destroy her, all of it. This is my destiny. The resolution was empowering. Kylo had never felt more certain of anything in his life. The more he contemplated it, the calmer he felt. This conviction was new and satisfying. He felt, dare he believe it, no conflict. This was the closest he had come to peace in as long as he could remember. There were no voices in his head, no opposing emotions. There was only cold, powerful darkness. Kylo hesitated on his course to his quarters as a sharp pain spread through his chest. It was concerning because it was not a physical pain. He sensed profound despair with a bitter aftertaste of failure, a condition he had become well acquainted with throughout his life. It was oppressive and desperate in nature, curious only in its divergence from his current contradictory resolution. His eyes narrowed as he held his breath, waiting. For what? He wasn't certain. A fleeting sensation in the Force passed through his consciousness. The source echoed with eerie, dreadful familiarity. Before he could probe into his disturbance, it disappeared, and the emptiness returned. He continued walking slowly, stubbornly determined to maintain his current emotional state. Rather than analyze the possibilities of the abnormal disruption in the Force, as he focused on his emotions, his conviction returned. Red. The peaceful feeling was short-lived. It always was. He dropped his head and sighed quietly as annoyance crept up his spine. General Hux, he acknowledged, without turning to face him. There are thousands of others to irritate on this ship. Find one willing to tolerate you. I warned you, Ren, the general spluttered, stomping down the corridor towards him. Luke Skywalker, the most wanted man in the galaxy, was within our grasp, and you... Skywalker is dead, Kylo sneered. His patience with the other men wailed thin. He was all too aware that the edges of his emotional wounds were far more loathingly raw, exposed and fragile than he was willing to admit. And if anyone could elicit a sharp physical reaction from him, it was his vexing subordinate. He could not afford another embarrassment in front of the First Order. His weakness and instability were all too evident in his lapse of judgment and focus on Crate. If he did not render a strong, intimidating presence, a mutiny would strike at the first drop of blood, the first sign of vulnerability. I have felt the change in the Force. You should be with your officers celebrating this victory, he continued flatly, preferably as far away from me as physically possible. Your personal interests have cost the First Order victory. The Resistance escaped. They were cornered, defeated. Your emotions clouded your better judgment again. Your allegiance to the First Order is questionable Is it? Kylo's resolve to maintain a composed, dispassionate front lasted mere seconds. Hux was quite skilled at provoking his reactive nature. Kylo didn't bother turning to face his general. Instead, he stared down at his clenched fist, reveling in the quiet, choking sounds emanating from behind him. Careful, Hux. Your assertions could be misinterpreted as treason. I am your supreme leader. Be mindful not to forget that. His hand shook as he mercilessly manipulated the Force to constrict tighter around the man's windpipe. Kylo's own breath hissed through gritted teeth as a sadistic thrill pulsed through his veins. When he felt the general's consciousness slipping away, he released him from his grasp. Kylo continued to his quarters, 135 more steps, in apathic disinterest, leaving the general in a coughing fit on the floor. "Careful, Ren," Hux whispered between gasps, staring daggers into the Supreme Leader's back as he walked away. Bracing himself on his elbows, he swallowed another cough, his ordinarily immaculately groomed hair falling loosely into his burning eyes. "Snoke is no longer here to protect you." Force Destiny, Chapter 3. The hum of the sublight engines of the Millennium Falcon as it navigated hyperspace was a constant reminder of what the Resistance was escaping from. The remaining survivors celebrated their near victory, choosing to temporarily overlook the desolate circumstances that held them all prisoner. Escape would only ever be temporary as the First Order's grasp twisted perpetually farther into the galaxy. Rey sat quietly in self-imposed isolation, reanalyzing each detail of the events aboard the Supremacy in aching litany. The two broken halves of Luke's lightsaber lay cold and lifeless in her trembling hands. Upon her return to the Millennial Falcon, Chewbacca's wise words, advice she imagined had once been uttered by her hero, Han Solo, helped her focus on their dire situation on Crait. Now her friends were safe, however, and she had nothing but time to agonize over her failure in the throne room. Snoke had created a bridge between their minds. That was her only certainty. Had he manipulated their joint visions? Had the vile creature manipulated it to draw her into a trap? Or was that a lie? Had Kylo created it himself? Had he been manipulating her through the bond since the moment it first opened? "You'll bring Luke Skywalker to me," he had said in their first connection. After he realized his forced trickery wouldn't produce the desired results, he had employed another method. Either way, she had been foolish enough to fall for it. Rey had unwisely believed Kylo had turned when he killed Snoke. She had felt the connection between them when they fought the guards together. Her mistake was trusting him. She had begged him not to turn back to the darkness, not to turn his back on her. But he wouldn't listen, because he didn't care. She had been naive, believing in the vision, that the light she had felt in him was enough. It was all a lie. Kylo's singular mission from the moment she first met him was to find Luke. The touch of his hands, the words he knew she longed to hear, the softness of his voice. It was a trap to gain access to her knowledge of the map. And by crossing the galaxy in hope of saving him, she had given him exactly what he needed. If Luke hadn't given his life confronting his nephew to save the Resistance, then Kylo would have found him. He would never have chosen her because she was nothing to him. In the throne room, she had believed as he lay unconscious that her failure stemmed from not anticipating the strength of the hold the darkness had over him. His actions on Crait proved her wrong. Not only had he stood by as their ships were destroyed, but he actively chose to kill them all. If her vision had been real, he would have turned. He would have helped them end the war. He chose to double down on his evil instead. Shutting that door on him, their bond, and her hope in him, had been more difficult than she had ever anticipated. But it changed nothing. There was no saving him. The more the day's events replayed in her mind, the more she felt certain of it. Even if she could turn him, she didn't want to try anymore. The misery she felt in her failure wasn't worth it. She had never needed anyone. She certainly didn't need him, and the Resistance didn't need him to win the war. Leia had said that they had everything they needed to win, and Rey believed her because she had hope. Rey didn't hate him for behaving like the monster he had become. She wasn't angry at him, but with herself for believing him. Ben or Kylo, she had to forget him. All that mattered was that the good side prevailed. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The resistance had to win the war. If we have to go through him to do it, so be it. He chose this path. Rey tried her best to suppress the conflict, tearing her insides to shreds as she watched Leia dress the remaining survivors. The woman had survived the loss of her parents, her entire planet, her husband, and her twin brother. Her son had betrayed her in the worst imaginable way, and he was all but lost to her. Yet Leia stayed strong. She smiled. Her eyes were filled with hope. Rey was in no mood to celebrate, however. While the others were distracted by reliving their harrowing escape, she silently slipped away before the tears in her eyes would betray her. The others were ignorant of the secrets behind those tears, and she intended to keep it that way. She wandered the rounded halls of Han's ship, the echoes of memories still imprinted on the walls. If she listened hard enough, she could almost hear the ghosts of happier times. Kylo had wandered those same steps as a young boy before he threw it all away. Why? Why would you turn your back on everything I have ever wanted? I saw you on the floor on Crate. I saw the remorse in your eyes. Have you finally realized, too late, what you have done? Or do you only regret that we escaped? Who are you? Truly. As she rounded a corridor, she jerked to a stop as the galaxy dropped away from under her. The peripheral sound faded away, and there was a sharp tug at the base of her neck. She felt that stomach-churning rippling of his presence in the Force. No, please don't do this, she begged the universe. This was supposed to be over. You can't do this to me again. The Force did not answer, save for the buzzing of energy around her, like electricity in the air. Rey stared at the floor of the corridor, noticing that it gave way to a smooth black surface that didn't belong on the Millennium Falcon. She couldn't bring herself to meet the eyes of the man she knew would be there. She couldn't confirm her worst fears. I am Kylo Ren, a voice said in the space between them. It sounded nothing like the one that had promised she wasn't alone. I am the Supreme Leader. I will destroy the Jedi and the Resistance. I will bring order to the galaxy. Reluctantly, Rey raised her eyes from the floor. Force Destiny, Chapter 4. Kylo stormed into his quarters, tossing his cape across the room. Red salt still clung to the underside of the fabric where he had dropped it, a tangible reminder of defeat. He wished the dust was permanent to remind himself of his past failures whenever he wore it. The scars would do. Rey had bested him on Starkiller. Luke had on Crate, both wielding his emotional weaknesses against him. Never again. His rage would suffocate every last emotion inside him until there was nothing left. The darkness would free him. Kylo stopped short at the foot of his bed. There were nondescript boxes piled neatly on the floor. Removing a top, he recognized the items as personal belongings he had with him aboard the Supremacy. The droids had been quick to gather them from the wreckage and deliver them to his chambers, the only proof that he had not dreamed it all. His mind had been so fixated on the events on Crate, he had forgotten that the Supremacy had been damaged. He hadn't thought to question why he was back aboard the Finalizer. It was almost as if he hadn't killed Snoke, as if his master was merely on the Supremacy, waiting to train the weaknesses out of him. He had known Snoke was gone, of course. There was no denying the freedom he felt at becoming the only voice in his own head. But in that moment, reality finally sank its teeth deep into his flesh. A chill shuddered down his spine. Snoke was dead. Forever. He was not aboard the Supremacy waiting for Kylo. He would not hold his once apprentice accountable for his failures again. Kylo was the master now. He was the supreme leader of the First Order. This kingdom was his, and his alone. Darkness swirled through him at the thought of the insurmountable power. A weight lifted off his chest. Forget Rey, the Bond, Luke, his mother, the Resistance. He finally had everything he had ever wanted. He had done it. This was real. The boxes before him proved that. Striding to the boxes against the far wall, he opened the lid to discover that the droids had left him Snoke's belongings as well. Scrolls, ancient texts, a holo projector, a ring, and Kylo's broken helmet. He kept it. A sickening disgust rolled through him at the sight of it. "You're just a child in a mask," his fallen master had said, knowing how profoundly it would wound him, how weak it would make him. It was with those words that he had realized that he was Snoke's rabid cur. "I'll show them a child in a mask," he promised to the empty room, "just as I showed him." The helmet had crumpled around the force of his blows, twisted and split into pieces. Now, without the bond, he was stronger, unstoppable. He would make this mask stronger too. As broken as he had once been, it would show the galaxy exactly who he was now. The mask would also grant him an escape from the shadow of legends. Once the Resistance was gone, his identity would be unknown. Ben Solo would be dead. Kylo Ren would be the ruler of the galaxy, remembered. His actions speaking louder in his anonymity. He was anyone and no one. Exactly what the galaxy needed, exactly what he had always wanted to be. Kylo didn't need this helmet, of course. He could have another one, created from the finest materials in the galaxy. But this one, rebuilding this one would show the Resistance that Kylo Ren had been tempted by the light of a nothing scavenger, but he had been made stronger. The helmet would show her that she had failed to turn him or destroy him. He had been a fool, believing it doesn't matter anymore, he reminded himself. What mattered was that she had betrayed him, and he had finally found his place in the darkness. Now he was greater than even his master had imagined. He would show them all the monster that they had created, and this time he would destroy them all. Kylo brought the mask into the receiving hall of his antechambers. A black stone throne commanded the center of the vast room. It was simple in its design compared to the ornate ostentatiousness of the one located in Snoke's throne room on the Supremacy, but it served its purpose. Before he died, Snoke had used the room to keep his apprentice under his thumb from across the galaxy. It was a constant reminder that he was never too far out of reach. Kylo had been required to attend to his master's projection in the receiving hall whenever Snoke deigned to appear. During the periods of punishment for weakness, Snoke had often been the only contact he had had for days or weeks. His failure on Starkiller had prompted a more severe punishment, earning him a stay on the Supremacy instead, but it was the same method. Locked away in his chambers, his knights purposely sent away on missions across the galaxy, he had been isolated from everyone. That was how Rey had the opportunity to tempt him in the first place, though he supposed that had been his master's intention all along. Kylo climbed his days and released a slow exhale as he stared at the throne. "It's mine." His fingers trailed over the smooth surface. The stone was cold under his touch. Steeling his nerves, he lowered himself with a tentative stiffness onto the throne he had sacrificed everything to possess. He sat rigidly, waiting. For what? He wasn't sure. A change, perhaps? an electric sensation in the force, something open, honest, and true that left him feeling as if he were exactly where he was meant to be, as he had felt in that hut when he touched. It didn't matter when he had felt it before. He craved to feel it again, in this place where he knew he was destined to be. This was everything he believed he had ever wanted. Only he didn't feel what he had expected. He was supreme leader. This was his throne. Yet it felt wrong. It was like shoving a circular object into a square hole. Certainly it fit, but there was an emptiness, a glaring incompatibility that could not be ignored. What is wrong with me? Shoving those thoughts away, he turned the broken pieces of the helmet over in his hand. It was barely recognizable. The metal had been twisted and crushed under the wrath of his profound rage. Still, it wasn't as damaged as his past. At least this was repairable. Kylo manipulated the force to unbend the metal first, working to smooth the gouges and depressions as best he could with the energy at his disposal. Then he ignited his lightsaber to haphazardly fuse the pieces back together, one fragment at a time. The plasma liquefied the metal along the cracks, forming a fortified bond where the pieces fit together. Where the fractures had once shown weakness, the welds reinforced the mask, making it stronger than it had ever been before. The helmet itself was even more deformed. The edges binding the pieces were jagged and raised. The clean arcs of the silver embellishments were splintered and asymmetrical, unbalanced. Kylo didn't care. The helmet had seen its fair share of damage in combat, and its battered resilience reflected his own. More importantly, it did nothing to detract from its anonymity or intimidating appearance. He was a creature of darkness, after all. Kylo placed the helmet over his head, pressing the hinge mechanism to secure it. The servo motor sparked, creating small plumes of smoke from the damage he had wrought upon it. The servo motor sparked, creating small plumes of smoke from the damage he had wrought upon it. The voice modulator crackled and hissed as he spoke into it. I am Kylo Ren. I am the Supreme Leader. I will destroy the Jedi and the Resistance. I will bring order to the galaxy. A tingle of energy down his spine was his only warning before he heard a sharp gasp. His head snapped up to see her standing before his throne. Every muscle was paralyzed in shock. He blinked as if she would disappear when he reopened his eyes, but she still stood before him in all her ferocity. His mind stalled, as it had the first time their bond had opened. It's impossible. The bond was severed. Time was frozen. Neither moved nor broke their fierce stare. The only sound in the room was the echo of their heavy breaths, her shallow and quick, and his hissing through the malfunctioning voice modulator of his crudely repaired helmet. He wouldn't be the first one to break and show weakness by giving voice to the thoughts in his mind. The air was heavy enough with their warring emotion that words were unnecessary. None were consequential enough to be spoken at that moment anyway. After her initial shock faded, Rey's eyes narrowed, and she held his stare defiantly. It was as if their connection on Crate had resumed where it left off, but he would not yearn for answers to her betrayal as he had done then. He'd had time to step back and see the situation clearly, to see her for the liar, manipulator, and the traitor that she was. He was a fool for trusting her and believing that she was different than anyone else he had let in. She had been convincing. He'd give her that. The most convincing one yet. Regardless, she had helped him in the long run. She had killed the last bit of light inside him. The darkness had hardened his weak, pathetic heart. He didn't care anymore. He was better off alone. She was as good as dead to him. Judging by the fire in her eyes, the feeling was mutual. Her entire body was tense, apoplectic, and he did not doubt that if she had the access to a weapon, she would have chanced a futile attempt at firing at him again. Perhaps she would be more creative this time. She did have his lightsaber. From the very first time they met, she had never feared him, but he would change that. Her fearlessness was something he had once admired about her, but now he recognized it as the path to her downfall. After her betrayal, he saw through her lies, knew the true reason she didn't fear him. It was not her belief in her own strength, but her mistaken confidence in his weakness, his conflict. Kylo would show them all the consequences of underestimating him. He would finish what his grandfather started. Nothing would stand in his way, especially not the aspiring Jedi standing in his path rather than by his side, currently staring boldly into the visor of his mask. She couldn't see the resolution in his eyes. He found both irritation and relief in that. Kylo Ren. The fear found him easily in the darkness. Her words were in his thoughts. Kylo was quite familiar with the voices in his head, but not hers. There were no mistaking it, however. The voice he had heard was Rey's. He was certain of it. The bond. Not only is it not broken, he realized, it's stronger. She hadn't shut out the bond, only closed the connection. Even if Snoke had created it, it superseded his death. Therefore, it had become the will of the Force. Kylo didn't know much about Force bonds, but he knew enough about the will of the Force to understand the significance of their connection and the implication of its escalation. With a jolt, she was gone, safe somewhere across the galaxy. She was never actually in the room with him, of course, but that was her choice. In denying him, she had fled back to them. He recognized exactly what ship she was still aboard, knowing the corridor she was standing in better than anyone. Desperate for air, he ripped off his helmet. Relief flooded his veins as their bond was still intact. But with its return came the ache in his chest that he had felt on Crate. He tamped it down quickly, channeling the anger from her betrayal. I hate this bond, he reminded himself. I hate her. I will destroy her. Had he not called that lightsaber when she ripped it away from him, she would have succeeded in killing him. She should have finished it when she awoke first, because he wouldn't hesitate to kill her. The ache in his chest, it meant nothing. He would use it to become stronger, and the relief he felt at the return of the bond, that was only due to the gift the Force had presented him. She had used him to save the Resistance. Now he would use her and their cursed bond to find them and destroy them all. The split second before the darkness found him in his anger, he swore he could hear the gravelly chuckle of a man he hoped he would never hear again, taunting him with another proclamation of, amazing, every word of what you said was wrong. Kylo jumped to his feet, holding his breath in all-consuming fear. His eyes darted around the room, searching for another apparition. The room, the Force, his mind was quiet. Shaking his head, he tried to convince himself it was fearful hallucination. It's not real. It's impossible. He's dead. I felt it. Still, he found himself struggling to swallow. He couldn't shake the trepidation tightening in his throat. See you around, kid, echoed tauntingly in his memory. Force Destiny, Chapter 5. The moment the connection closed, the tears began to fall. Rey had cried when she left the Supremacy, certainly. The wait in the escape shuttle for Chewbacca and the Millennium Falcon were the loneliest moments she had felt since she left Jakku. She had sobbed in fear for her friends who were losing their lives and for the man she had left unconscious on the floor of a broken ship. That was before Crate, when Kylo revealed how evil he could be. Though it had been difficult to hate him in the last connection on that base, with his sorrowful eyes staring back at her, everything else had been lost in the urgency. It had been easier then, when her friends were in immediate danger, to push aside what had happened between them. She had never considered how painful it would be to see him again without that distraction. She most certainly had not considered seeing him again so soon. Emotions she had successfully buried since she had left the supremacy suddenly overwhelmed her the moment she saw his face. No, not his face. Mask. Not just any mask, but the mask she hadn't seen him wear since the Skyway when he killed his father on Starkiller. The longer he had gone without it, the more he seemed to transform back into Ben Solo. After all that had transpired in the hut, she had every reason to have hope that he would turn. He had understood her, promised she would never be alone. She had been so certain he would turn. The mask had left her with little doubt that he was any closer to Ben Solo now than when she first met him on Takodana, perhaps even further down the path of darkness. As painful as it had been to see him again, the mask made it easier to hate him. It made it easier to pretend it was only her enemy, Kylo Ren, not the short glimpse of the man she had thought was Ben Solo. Rey dreaded the day she would have to meet his burning stare again. Kylo may have been lost to the darkness, but she knew that whatever had happened to them on Ahch-To wasn't over. It changed nothing. She had to let him go, so she could save the galaxy from his wrath. She had to let him go. If she ignored him long enough, perhaps whatever it was between them would fade. That meant she would have to ignore the aching pain that was tearing at her heart, making it difficult to breathe. It was worse now, the loneliness, but she would survive. She was good at it. Rey was wandering aimlessly when she stumbled upon the cot containing the unconscious woman she had only glimpsed briefly after escaping Crate. Rey didn't even know her name, how she had come to the Resistance, or why she was unconscious. The only thing that mattered was there was hope. She was alive. Finn had spent most of his time checking on her or sitting with her. She was clearly important to him. Anyone important to him was important to Rey. Straightening the blanket over the woman, as she had watched Finn do, Rey wondered if moments like that were what having a family was like. She imagined that was how parents comforted their children when they were sick or had nightmares. She wondered if this young woman had parents, if they were missing her, or if she was missing them. She wondered who the woman was. Could she find family in her too? Rey was so singularly focused on the unconscious woman that she hadn't heard or felt anyone approach. "Her name is Rose," the familiar comforting voice said. She dried her tears before turning around to face her friend. "Hey, Finn. I didn't see you." "You okay?" he asked, wrapping her in a tight embrace. Finn gave the best hugs. It was everything she imagined she would feel if she had a family. It was soothing, centering, and warm, like the first meal in days. She released a long, slow exhale, and the tension drained from her body. She smiled. "I will be, I think. You?" He released her from his embrace, but his arm remained around her back in support as he turned to stare down at Rose. "I will be, when she wakes up, when I know you're both safe." Rey studied the concern on his face before turning back to the woman. She knew that farewell, being across the galaxy from her friend when he was injured, without word from the Resistance about his condition, had been excruciating. Her apprehension hadn't eased until she had found him alive and well on Crate. What happened to her? Finn reached forward to straighten the perfectly arranged blanket. "She crashed her speeder into my speeder. It was my fault. She stopped me from flying my speeder into a battering ram cannon on Crate. She saved my life." Rey couldn't hide her gasp as she turned to stare at him in disbelief. The news had blindsided her, viscerally terrified her. Goosebumps crawled over her skin and bile rose in her throat. Finn, her friend, more than a friend, family, had almost sacrificed himself. She was proud of him for finding his place in the Resistance, but she had almost lost the most important person in her life. He was her rock in this terrifying new place. What would she have done without him? Ray turned back toward Rose, viewing the woman in a new light. Not only did she want the woman to live for her friend's sake, but for hers as well. She owed this stranger everything. She had saved her only family. Then I am forever in her debt, she said softly. I can't do this without you, my friend. Ray hugged him again, tighter, as if she could squeeze him strongly enough to erase the visions of losing him from her mind. On Octu, she had been so concerned about him healing from what Kylo had done that she hadn't thought about how it might have changed him. She could feel it now, how he had changed. He was braver and had found a purpose and belonging, but she was still the kind, caring man she had met on Jakku. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you until now, he whispered. No, thank you for being honest with me, she replied. It didn't make her feel any better. Finn was nothing but honest with her, and she was hiding a secret that would break his heart. Kylo had almost killed him, and she had gone to him on the supremacy. Tell him you'll explain later, Chewie had suggested when she had tried to decide what to tell her best friend before putting her alive in the hands of their enemy. But she couldn't explain. Not only had she gone to the man who had tried to kill them all, she had failed, putting them all at risk, and Finn had nearly sacrificed himself because of it. Even worse, the danger hadn't passed. Rey was still connected to their enemy. Finn stepped out of her arms, grasping her shoulder tightly. Rey, I need to tell you something else. What's wrong? Rey studied his eyes for a clue, fearful what she would find. His tone had sounded apprehensive. Whatever it wasn't good. After her confrontation with Kylo, she wasn't certain how much more she could manage. What if something terrible had happened? What if they didn't want her at the Resistance? What if they knew? He exhaled slowly. It's just, you and Rose are both important to me, and I hope you can't. Anyone important to you is important to me, Finn, she said, hoping that was all it was. Perhaps Finn believed she would think Rose was replacing her as his friend. There couldn't be anything further from the truth. She didn't know Rose, but she trusted Finn. They could expand their family with more friends. It wasn't a competition. There was nothing that could come between them. Finn smiled, visibly relaxing. Good. I have a lot to tell you. I have so much to tell you too, she wanted to tell him. She couldn't do it. She wasn't strong enough yet. One day soon, he would know. And I have all the time in the galaxy now, she said instead. Finn grabbed her hand, dragging her away from Rose. Rey happily allowed him to guide her to the nearby game table. Sitting down across from him, she was reminded of their trip from Jakku to Takodana. So much had changed. Too much. Finn activated a switch on the table, and holographic creatures popped up on the board. Finn was excited in a way that made her giggle. It didn't require much to make him happy, and Rey loved that about him. I missed you, he said as he began a new game. After everything that's happened. You have no idea, she replied. Rey smiled as Chewbacca passed by with a friendly growl on his way back to the cockpit. Where are we going? I don't know, he shrugged. Far from here, I guess. I don't care, as long as it's as far from the First Order as possible, as far from him as possible.